Okay. Hi, everybody. Very nice to see you. Hope my sound's okay. Hi, Dolores and Claudette Omlar. Nice to see you here tonight. And Rob Rivera. How are you, Rob? Hi, Deborah. And Carmen. Nice to see you. Hi, Kay. Hi, Russ. Oh, thanks, Russ. That's good to know. Avril says, nice to see you as well. Sound is yummy. Great. Glad I'm done with that technical problem, at least when I'm on solo. Hi, Lana. Anyone think Barr will get impeached? I hope so. It would be a start. Well, the progressives are pressuring Jerry Nadler to impeach him. Trouble is, Jerry thinks it's a waste of time. And Rob says, I'm doing good. How about yourself, Yoda? I'm doing very well, thanks. Feeling quite good, well rested, having a wonderful time with Stephanie's book, going over Stephanie's book. By the way, Pavlina's book on the job guarantee is due out on June 26th. So, not long after the appearance of Pavlina's book, I think we're going to be doing a series on the job guarantee, reviewing her book too, because that is liable to be a milestone as well. I don't think it'll be quite as popular, but it'll be a milestone for people interested in MMT and the job guarantee and the Green New Deal. It'll be very important. So, I suppose we should begin tonight by spending a little time discussing election results. You've heard, of course, that Jamal has won in the Bronx. AOC has also won, and Mondaire Jones has won Westchester County. And in Mondaire Jones's district, it's a heavily blue district. So the odds are heavily in his favor to win in the election in the fall. And Jamal Bowman, even more certain to win in the fall. So we can pretty well say that another two progressives who are likely to be either members of the squad or very closely related to the squad have been added. A wonderful result. Now, these results aren't final because there are a lot, of mail-in votes that still have to come in. But it looks like the margins for Jamal Bowman and for Mondaire Jones are too big to be overcome. And that is very good. It also looks like in the Kentucky primary for the Senate, it's looking good for Charlie Booker. Looking very good for him. It looks like he'll be the one to face Mr. Magoo. I mean, Mitch McConnell. So he'll probably have a chance to beat Mitch because the more he runs, I'm speaking of Charlie Booker now, the stronger he seems to get. He's a very, very forthright candidate. And one who looks like he'd be a great addition to the Senate ranks of the progressives, which, of course, as you know, are fairly thin at the moment. And we really need another senator, and we really need to beat Mitch. So last night was a very good night for progressives. Okay, there's also Richie Torres, who I think is so far showing up extremely well in his district, okay, in New York City, and who ran as a progressive. Now, the better candidate was probably Similis Lopez, who was endorsed by AOC. I think she's a more committed progressive and sincere progressive than Richie Torres is. But if he were to come out ahead in the end in his race, it would still be a big win for progressives. So New York City is maybe not so slowly turning not just blue, but blue, blue. Blue, 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 blue. It's turning Bernie Sanders blue. Which maybe you ought to characterize as a deeper blue-green. Anyway, we have to wait for final results in these things. But the initial results are certainly very hopeful. So I'm going to leave it there and go back to the book. And tonight, we'll be dealing with the value gaps. What Stephanie calls the deficits that matter. So let me share the screen. And let you see that. So I thought Stephanie started out with a really good quote from John Kennedy. That is Jack Kennedy, John F. Kennedy. As long as there is plenty, poverty is evil. My government belongs wherever evil needs an adversary and there are people in distress. And John F. Kennedy was certainly a New Dealer. No doubt about that. Also, Lyndon Johnson was a New Dealer too. Stephanie starts out from a personal point of view. I came to Washington in 2015 to join the staff of the Democrats on the Senate Budget Committee. When she joined, late in 2015, the Senate still belonged to the Democrats. So she was the chief economist for the committee. She wasn't simply the chief economist for the minority. She was the chief economist for the majority for just a few months. Was it just a few months or was it more? Anyway, by that point, we're well into the grinding recovery from the Great Recession. For decades, America has placed trust and power in a global network of financial and political elites who have profoundly failed to address the economic concerns of most people on the planet. The economic meltdown presented a brief opportunity to rethink our priorities. President Obama had been elected in the immediate aftermath of the crisis with a mandate for change and solid majorities in both chambers of Congress. But by the time I arrived, the Republicans had taken control of both the House and the Senate. And the status quo of senseless prudence and caution around deficit spending, these for social programs, had returned with a vengeance. The Democrats were in the majority, which left, were in the minority, which left the Republicans to call the shots and set the agenda. That left us playing defense. As I sat through meetings and helped to prepare talking points, I imagined the possibilities of being in the majority, focusing the agenda on the myriad challenges facing the American people and writing a budget that would help the millions lead more secure, productive, and happier lives. But with Democrats in the minority, I had little power to do much of anything. And in truth, it may not have mattered much. For all the rancor between the parties, everyone was pretty much on the same page when it came to how the federal government, quote, gets, unquote, the money it spends into the economy. Democrats and Republicans alike look at the federal budget the way they look at their own household budget, through the lens of a currency user rather than a currency issuer. The two sides broadly agreed that the nation faced a looming fiscal crisis and simply traded barbs over the root cause of the problem. Democrats focused on tax cuts and costly wars, while Republicans blamed overspending on programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Even if we'd been in power, I suspect Democrats would have bowed to the deficit myth. With Senator Sanders at the helm, the focus would have veered towards a Robin Hood approach, taxing the rich or cutting defense to pay for more generous spending elsewhere. But given the political realities, avoiding any increase in the deficit likely would have remained a top priority. Here I was in the halls of power, the chief economist for the Democrats, where I should have been able to make insights of MMT heard. Instead, I doubted whether my ideas could make any impact at all. I couldn't bear the thought I had taken a leave of absence from my teaching job, moved away from my friends and family. Stephanie's family was still in Kansas City at the time, and taken up a residence in Washington, D.C., only to be surrounded by people who spent most of their time worrying about the budget deficit. I spent much of my own time drowning in frustration. Then it struck me, a deficit is merely a gap between what we have and what we need. Yes, that's what it is. Specifically, it's a value gap. What we have and what we need, or what we have and what we think ought to be the case. And Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary literally defines a deficit as a deficiency in amount or quality, or a lack or impairment in an ability or functional capacity. Now, government's fiscal deficit wasn't cause for concern, but America faced other deficits that mattered enormously. Deficits in good jobs, in access to health care, in quality infrastructure, in a clean environment, in a sustainable climate, and more. If the senators on both the budget committee, wanted to talk about deficits so much, why not talk about those deficits instead? As luck would have it, the director of the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, Doug Elmendorf at the time, was scheduled to make an appearance before the committee. It was a routine thing, and I knew just what to expect. Elmendorf would arrive in a buttoned-up suit, wearing spectacles, and carrying a copy of the CBO's latest long-term budget outlook. He would start by walking the committee through the report's major findings, calling attention to projected budget shortfalls, and warning of the potential risk of a debt crisis if the government failed to get its fiscal house in order. Then the various senators would take turns grandstanding or arguing about whether we need to cut spending or raise taxes to fix the deficit problem. I couldn't bear the thought of sitting through such a pointless exercise, so I hatched a plan. My boss was the ranking member of the committee. That is Bernie Sanders, our boss. And it was customary for him to offer prepared remarks immediately following the chairman's opening statement. The staff had been asked to draft those remarks. I decided this was my entry point, my one chance to force an entirely new conversation. I proposed to the staff that we ignore the fiscal deficit completely and talk instead about the deficits that really matter. Fortunately, Senator Sanders listened to and cared deeply about ordinary people. He looked at the federal budget the way I did, as a moral document and an expression of our national priorities. We both believed that rather than a nation of rugged and atomized individualists, Americans share an interconnected destiny, that we all rise or fall together as a people. With that spirit as our shared foundation, Bernie, his staff, and I agreed to recraft his opening remarks. Instead of discussing, yet again, how to bring down projected fiscal deficits. We should speak to our other deficits in infrastructure, jobs, education, health, and so on. It fell to Bernie himself to sell the shift in focus, and he delivered. After the hearing, a headline in The Hill, the industry publication for Congress, declared, quote, Bernie Sanders flips the script with the deficits plan, unquote. The deficits we identified are the ones that affect ordinary people the most and that had been ignored for far too long. They are what lie at the core of any decent society. Our national infrastructure is crumbling. The cost of a college education is increasingly out of reach. And 45 million Americans are satisfied with more than $1.6 trillion in student loan debt. Income and wealth inequality are near record highs. Sorry. Having a little trouble with this outliner here. Average workers have seen their real wages increase by just 3% since the 1970s. Nearly 1 in 4 Americans say they will never be able to afford to retire. Our healthcare system is inadequate, to say the least, with 87 million people uninsured, underinsured. And flipping the script is as necessary now as it was then. Stephanie goes on, at the most basic conceptual level, America's federal budgeting process is a complete mess, utterly unable to grapple with these compounding crises. It's a process that assumes the government is cash constrained rather than a currency issuer. By its very nature, it blinds its participants to any ultimate goal other than balanced fiscal budgets over the long run. It's a process designed by technocrats to shackle policy options, to elevate the needs of abstract ledger entries over the needs of flesh and blood human beings. You may want to note, just to add a comment here, when this process was actually designed. And the answer is that it was designed during the 1970s, and that the Democrats had just as big a role in deciding it as did the Republicans at that time. It was designed at first during the Ford administration and given life by the founding of the CBO in 1974 and the appointment of its first head, who was a lady by the name of Alice Rivlin, who set the pattern for other directors of CBOs since then, and who set the orientation of fiscal responsibility, which had led to the appearance of Elmendorf in front of the Budget Committee and Stephanie when she first got involved in the hearings. So this process, this shackling process, goes back to 1974, just after the United States became a monetary sovereign, just after it went off the gold standard first temporarily in 1971 and then permanently in 1973. By 1 year later, the Congress had passed a bill designed to shackle future Congresses that would legislate, uh, and that if it did nothing, would have the full power of currency issuers. Instead, Congress designed this process to shackle itself. I just had to note that. It's very important. Now, as much as ever, we must talk about the deficits that matter. So let's do that. And here is Stephanie's list of the deficits that matter. Now, one might infer that if we were to fulfill all of these deficits, then from her point of view, we would come fairly close to accomplishing what we had to accomplish to achieve the public purpose of the United States. What I'm saying is, I think that this list of value gaps that Stephanie gives here is her attempt to flesh out what a public purpose means for economists. So, the good jobs deficit. Okay, to go on with this. And she starts with an example. Rick Marsh had put in 25 years at the GM plant in Lordstown, Ohio. When it closed down in the early months of 2019, Marsh's father, an elected official of the union, worked there before him. It was, as the New York Times noted, quote, the only real job he ever had, unquote. Marsh owns a house and has a daughter with cerebral palsy. He could get a job in the natural gas fields of western Pennsylvania for about half the pay he made at GM. Or he could use his seniority in the union to try to transfer to a GM plant elsewhere. But he and his wife are loath to take either option, as it would mean giving up the extensive network of support at school through local services they've painstakingly built up for their daughter. Marsh's story is a common one. The manufacturing employment of the United States remains well below the level seen before NAFTA, the WTO agreement, and other corporation-friendly trade deals that kicked the legs out from under Marsh's industry and so many others. The financial crisis didn't help either. 212,000 telecommunication jobs were lost by Americans, and 122,000 manufacturing jobs in the 8 years following 2008. Jobs in the public sector, work that has generally provided living wages as well as good benefits, have also declined. State and local governments cut some 361,000 jobs, while the U.S. Post Office shed 112,000 workers. Yes, the economy has been slowly recovering since the 2008 collapse and continues to create jobs as of this writing. Unemployment was at 3.7% at the start of 2020, way down from 10% at the height of the Great Recession. Yes, 10.4%, exactly. Yet that job growth has been overwhelmingly concentrated in low-skill, low-paid occupations. That's why millions of people are trying to cobble together enough income to survive by working 2 or 3 jobs. Quote, it's impossible to live on $8.25 an hour, unquote. Horacio Caravantes told the Chicago Tribune in 2014. At the time, Caravantes had to work 2 jobs, scrubbing floors and cleaning toilets in Chicago's luxury hotels, just to scrape together $495 every other week. It's less than, it's roughly $1,000 a month, a little more than $1,000 a month. Her rent was $500 a month. She had to travel an hour on public transit every day to reach her jobs, and she couldn't afford to miss a single day of work. And Caravantes told the Tribune that she thought if she was a good worker, her pay would increase. Quote, I was wrong, unquote, she said. Meanwhile, $8.25 an hour remains the minimum wage in Illinois. The federal minimum is a mere $7.25 an hour. No less than 40% of Americans say they would be unable to come up with $400 in an emergency. And make no mistake, poorly paid work is why. If there were many good jobs out there, that wouldn't be the case. If the labor market was really healthy and strong, employers would be forced to raise pay to attract workers. We may have revived the quantity of jobs available, but the quality of the new jobs is much lower. The food service sector, for example, has added 2 million jobs, while retail added 1.2 million. According to an economic news release by the Department of Labor, the average annual median salary for retail workers is $28,310, while food service and prep workers received even smaller income, averaging just over $22,000. In fact, nearly 3/4 of the jobs gained since the 2008 crisis have paid no more than $50,000 annually, with most paying significantly less. Inflation-adjusted wages for the average worker have grown only 3% from the 1970s to 2018. Only 3% over 50 years. That's 48 years, folks. Nearly 50 years. Workers in the bottom fifth of the income ladder have experienced a decline in wages during the same period. There's no inherent reason why jobs in retail or food service should pay worse than the jobs that came before. But there are industries where these are industries where unions never been able to achieve the foothold they gained in mid-century manufacturing. The industries where employers hold all the leverage and use every trick in the book, from outsourcing to franchising to hiring contractors rather than full-time workers, to keep pay and benefits as low as possible. There's also a geographic aspect to all this. The places where jobs can be found aren't the same as before. Several decades ago, during the recovery from the 1990 to 91 recession, rural markets and small towns in the heartland had some of the highest rates of job creation in the country. But that ability to bounce back has declined since. In the recovery from the Great Recession, the highest rates of employment growth happened in urban areas in big cities like LA, New York City, and Houston. Jobs in less dense areas and rural regions grew at less than a third of their previous rate. In some places, effectively, there was no recovery from 2008. The job market just pulled up stakes and left. Cairo, Illinois, I believe that's how you pronounce it, used to be a bustling town at the intersection of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, with shops and drive-ins and clubs. But deindustrialization and the depredations gave racism. Cairo is mostly African American, hit it hard. Now the town has $2 Generals and a few other stores to its name. When author and photographer Chris Arnatti um, asked um, 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 Marva, a 47-year-old local teacher, why she stayed. Her answer was simple, quote, Cairo is my home. It is a small community and it is my family. You can't just abandon the people you grow up with, unquote. There is something cruel in how the modern U.S. economy often forces people to choose between their roots and their livelihood. And even when people do prefer to leave, moving to a whole new city is often expensive, difficult, and risky. Meanwhile, for Americans lucky enough to live in the places where jobs are growing, they still often have to take worse jobs than before. This phenomenon, where people are laid off from good paying work and can only replace it with poorly paid work that isn't commensurate with their skills and education, is what economists call underemployment. For example, Halisa Casino Sheretz, a mother of two, earned a master's degree and once had a steady job with a six-figure salary. Then the crash came, the job disappeared, and Casino Sheretz had to take a job at a sports medical facility for $15 an hour. Then that job laid her off. So she had a six-figure, which is roughly $50 an hour, then another job at $15 an hour. Then that job laid her off, and she found work doing customer service for Amazon. Then that gig vanished too. Quote, you ask, why me? What did I do wrong? Unquote, she said. Of course, she did nothing wrong, did she? Underemployment affects such a broad array of people that writer Andrea Thompson devoted a whole blog to collecting their stories. That even includes Thompson's own 64-year-old grandmother. A cook all her life, Thompson's grandmother faced a string of medical surgeries and is now an underpaid lunch lady at the local high school. Recently diagnosed with diabetes, she can't afford the healthcare costs associated with her condition. This rampant sense that everyone is disposable affects Americans in all sorts of ways beyond employment and pay. In a 2018 survey by the American Psychiatric Association, two-thirds said they worried about meeting their expenses. The only comparable concerns were for their personal health and safety of their families, both of which are affected by financial status. As the APA website notes, nearly three-quarters of women, nearly three-quarters of young adults 8 to 24, and nearly 4 in 5 Hispanic adults are somewhat or extremely anxious about paying their bills, unquote. The 2017 survey in the Journal of Community Health showed that 1 in 3 working Americans believe their job is not secure. The experience of that vulnerability is correlated with significantly higher chances of obesity, poor sleep, smoking, lost work days, and worsening health in general. Economists Susan Case and Angus Deaton studied the steep rise in mortality among the middle-aged, the white Americans since 1999, and found the big causes were suicide, drugs, and alcoholism, the so-called deaths of despair. These deaths were driven primarily by economic anxiety. Workers in the United States aren't the only ones facing these challenges. David N.F. Bell and David G. Blanchflower found that In the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, underemployment pulled down wages in most of the 25 European countries they studied. But American workers have an even harder hill to climb than the European peers. Employment in the U.S. compares unfavorably to many of the European countries. Moreover, the U.S. is the only developed country that doesn't require its employers to offer paid maternity leave. In fact, it's the only one that doesn't require employers to offer paid leave of any sort. Some American employers step up on their own, of course, but as a group, U.S. workers get little more than 1/4 the vacation time of workers in Britain, France, or Spain. Not to mention the vacation time in Germany, the time off in Germany. I checked this out, a few years ago. In Germany, full-time work is roughly 1,400 hours a year. 1,400 hours a year compared to an average of something like 1,870 hours here in the United States. There has been much talk of well-paid manufacturing jobs that are moving abroad and the impact that's had on the American dream. In the industrial Midwest, Trump eked out a win in 2016, promising a return to greatness in a time when it was possible to hold down a manufacturing job and live a stable and a rewarding life. My guess is that what people really long for are the days when a single breadwinner could support a family, buy a home, put 2 cars in the garage, and send the kids to college, take the family on vacation once a year, and retire with a decent pension. It comes out as, quote, bring back manufacturing jobs, unquote, or, quote again, make America great again, unquote. But it's really about replacing the lost sense of job security and what a middle-income job was once able to provide. Ultimately, the good jobs deficit comes down to the way money flows through the economy. Right now, those flows grant good pay and great benefits to a small portion of fortunate Americans and meager pay and little to no benefits to a great many more. But money, as MMT notes, is the one resource the federal government can't run out of. There's no reason every job, all the way down to retail clerk or fast food worker or janitor in a luxury Chicago hotel, can't be a good job with dignified pay, hours, security, and benefits. The next chapter will explain how MMT's proposal to create a federal job guarantee can set a minimum standard for all employers to meet with a livable wage and benefits package for anyone who wants it. MMT also offers other tools to tackle the problems of paid leave and vacation time so that our quality of life can improve, and with it, our health and our sense of well-being. These ideas can deliver full employment, lifting incomes for those at the bottom and spreading the benefits up the income the ladder, effectively eliminating America's deficit of good-paying jobs. As we transform our economy for a greener, safer, and more secure future, we can give Americans the quality of work that they deserve. Next, the savings deficit. The good jobs deficit has all sorts of ripple effects through American society. The loss of good jobs means a loss of good pay, which means the inability to save. There was a time when, for many Americans, it was reasonable to hope that one college degree would lead to a well-paying job that offered security, decent, if not great, health benefits, and the ability to look forward to a stable retirement. But not anymore. Instead of saving for their golden years, workers are still paying off student debt into their 40s and even 50s. They wonder how they'll ever have enough to retire. If they have children, they stress about paying for an education. Enter the savings deficit. In fact, it's fair to say, says Stephanie, the typical working American has no money put away for retirement. One study found the median retirement account balance among people of working age in the United States is zero. That means half of the people of working age in the United States have a zero retirement account balance. I mean, that's amazing. Other surveys find the portion of Americans with nothing saved but for retirement ranges from 21% to 45%. And the portions get even larger than that when you include people with only $5,000 to $10,000 saved. By far, the biggest reasons people give for their lack of savings are insufficient incomes and the cost of paying bills. No less than 66% of Americans believe they'll outlive what they have saved up. There are slightly more than 200 million working age Americans, and over 100 million do not own any form of retirement assets, meaning employer-based 401ks, individual accounts, or pensions. Low-income workers are predictably even worse off. 51% have no retirement savings. The workers who do have retirement accounts have an average balance of $40,000. Still, 77% of Americans do not have adequate retirement savings for their age and income level. In June 2019, 1 in 5 people over the age of 65 were working, if not actively searching for a job. Another 2019 poll from the Associated Press NORC Center for Public Affairs Research found that nearly 1/4 of Americans expect to never retire at all. It was not always that way. The baby boomers came of age in relatively tranquil periods of economic growth. Their parents, the so-called greatest generation, were born into the Great Depression but experienced periods of progress. Social Security was created, the GI Bill was enacted, unemployment insurance was expanded, and the economy experienced a decades-long boom after World War II. To be sure, that growth was unequal. African Americans were largely excluded by segregation. Some of these periods were marked by political strife, but these generations typically expected to do better than their parents. The American dream was alive and mostly well, at least for the majority. Life expectancies and other health outcomes were improving overall, and productivity gains were shared between employers and employees. Sears, which recently filed for bankruptcy, shared the fruits of its profits with workers through the 1960s and 70s. Stock options, profit-sharing programs, and pensions were enjoyed by all employees from janitors to top executives. As we've already covered, the doom and gloom scenarios about Social Security are merely perpetuations of the deficit myth. But a big change that really has wrecked Americans' retirement security is the disappearance of defined benefit pension plans. Those kinds of plans, which guaranteed a set payment of income in retirement, used to be a staple for the immediate post-war generation, not to mention comprehensive health benefits and in many cases a union card. But around 1980, employers began replacing pensions with defined contribution plans, such as 401ks, in which how much retirement income the plan pays out depends on how much employees are able to sock away into the plan over the course of their working lives. These days, working people are generally expected to save for their retirement, but they can't save when they're struggling to make ends meet. And of course, increasingly, they've been doing that because wages have not increased, as you've heard. since the 1970s, or increased by only 3%. Many families now reflect the title of Senator Elizabeth Warren's book, The Two-Income Trap: Why Middle-Class Parents Are Going Broke, co-authored with her daughter Amelia Warren Tiagi. With pay stagnating and costs for health care and college tuition rising, both parents are forced to work to cover basic costs, struggling to keep their families in the middle class while experiencing high levels of insecurity about the future. Though published in 2004, the book's central premise, the hollowing out of the middle class, has only become more urgent and pervasive today. Rising educational costs mean they have to pay more for their children's college tuition, while rising healthcare costs and reduced employer health benefits further erode saving power. The gradual disappearance of that defined benefit pensions robs individuals and families of income security, increasing the need to save even as it became harder to put away money. The savings deficit has persisted through the recovery, quote unquote, from the Great Recession. A recent Wall Street article outlined how families, rather than saving for the future, are going into debt through unsecured personal loans and other forms of financing in order to stay precariously within the middle income range. Debt, apart from housing shortages, spiked by $1 trillion between 2013 and 2019. Now, this, by the way, note was in the so-called recovery period from the recession, the Obama recovery, which continued with the Trump recovery, right? Debt spiked by $1 trillion. The rise mainly attributed to surging levels of student debt, auto loan, and unpaid credit card balances. In one example, a young couple in West Hartford, Connecticut, both 28 years old, earn $130,000 between them working tech jobs. They have $51,000 in combined student debt, $18,000 in auto loans, and $50,000 in credit card debt. Add to this a $270,000 mortgage and the costs associated with a baby daughter and daycare. They no longer go out to eat and had to go deeper in debt after a car accident. A Seattle area couple, both 34 years old, whose combined income of $155,000 have $88,000 in student debt and $1,200 per month in daycare costs for their son. They pay $1,750 in rent per month because they can't afford to buy a two-bedroom house in Seattle, where the median home value is nearly $750,000. Sounds like Ashburn, Virginia, where I live. Both these couples, even with their relatively high joint incomes, can't afford to buy a home, let alone save. Not surprisingly, the savings deficit plays out differently among racial and ethnic groups. An Economic Policy Institute study that tracked retirement savings of families headed by someone aged 32 to 65 found severe disparities among whites, African Americans, and Hispanics. While 65% of white families had some savings as of 2013, only 26% of Hispanic families and 41% of African American families had anything set aside for retirement. And these numbers represent decreases of 12% for Hispanics and 6% for Blacks from the number of families who had savings before the Great recession. So, just to note the obvious, the election of Obama in 2008, in part to help to pull us out of the recession, ended up with the major minority groups being worse off than they were before the recession. Obama did them absolutely no good, which is maybe part of the reason why Donald Trump won in 2016. Sorry, couldn't resist that. Among those Black and Hispanic families that do have savings, the amount they have pales in comparison to that of whites. The median savings for those white families who had retirement accounts was $73,000, while only $22,000 for Black and Hispanic families. And again, unlike white families, the retirement accounts of Blacks and Hispanics did not rebound after the Great Recession. While the median savings for whites increased $3,387 from 2007 to 2013, the median savings for Hispanics decreased $5,508, and for Blacks decreased $10,561. I think that's because Hispanics and Blacks were losing their homes through the mortgage foreclosure racket. But anyway, apart from that, okay, note that $73,000 in a retirement account is not a lot of money. If you can consider what the return on that might be per year, it's probably something around $4,000 if one is going to make a conservative investment. So if a person with $73,000 in their retirement account were to retire just then, they would have an additional $4,000 per year to add to their Social Security. That's it. So as much inequality as there was, and as much of the disparity there was between 73,000 and 22,000 for Black and Hispanic families, the $73,000 median retirement account for white families was also grossly inadequate and pales before the median savings that you find among typical Europeans who have state pensions developing over the years. Anyway, economic injustice also persists between men and women, as the Economic Policy Institute notes, quote, at every education level, women are paid consistently less than their male counterparts, and the average wage for a man with a college degree is higher than the average wage for a woman with an advanced degree, unquote. Women had more households than ever before, so pay discrimination makes it even harder for them to save. So too does the absence of affordable childcare. The savings deficit may seem insurmountable, but we saw in Chapter 6 that there's no reason to doubt Social Security's fiscal solvency. And there is every reason to call for expanded Social Security benefits and a more robust public retirement system. MMT also gives us the tools to make good-paying jobs available to all Americans again, not to mention to immediately erase student debt and make childcare affordable or even free, both of which would free up thousands of dollars families could use to shore up their retirement savings or build equity through buying a home. Working families should save, but first we must build an economy in which they can. In order to make that happen, one of the most significant problems we need to address is our health care deficit. But before we move on to that, let's note that Elizabeth Warren is once again pushing, along with Chuck Schumer, and I forget who else, is pushing Elizabeth Warren magnificent plan to expand Social Security benefits by $200 per month. $200 per month. $2,400 per year for people whose median income from Social Security is what? Was it quoted at $14,000? That is nothing like what we need. That is nothing. I'm not going to use the expression that describes that silly proposal, that silly, inadequate bill to make her look like a progressive, but I digress. In order to make that happen, one of the most significant problems we need to address is our healthcare deficit. So, that's the third value gap, the healthcare deficit. We're paying for the American healthcare deficit with our lives. Yes, many of us are. In 1970, the United States had the highest life expectancy of any developed country. 1970, less than 50 years ago. By 2016, it lagged behind the average for most developed countries, that is, the members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. Today, America has the lowest life expectancy of the most advanced and long-term developed OECD members. The infant mortality rate in the U.S. is more than twice the average for all developed countries. Only Chile, Turkey, and Mexico have higher rates of infant mortality than the United States. Our healthcare deficit doesn't really play out between America and the rest of the world. Longevity among Americans differs significantly based on factors like socioeconomic status and race. From 1980 to 2010, life expectancy for the wealthiest Americans rose dramatically to 88.8 years. Meanwhile, for the poorest American men, it actually fell slightly over that same period to 76.1 years, a gap of 12.7 years in life expectancy based on economic inequality. For women, this life gap was 91.9 years for the wealthiest and 78.3 years for the poorest. That is a gap of 13.6 years. Or we can take a specific place like Baltimore as an example. In the city's low-income areas, life expectancy is nearly 20 years less than it is in the wealthiest areas. In the neighborhoods like the Madison East End, which are 90% black, the life expectancy rate was less than 69 years, while in the nearby Medfield, Hampton, Woodbury, and Remington neighborhoods, which is 78% white, life expectancy is 76.5 years. It's not that the U.S. doesn't spend money on healthcare. We actually spend a lot more than any other developed country, $10,586 per capita, according to OECD data. That's more than double Canada's per capita spending of $4,974 per capita. For instance, Spain spends $3,323 per capita and is forecasted to have the highest life expectancy rate by 2040 at 85.8 years. The U.S. is predicted to be ranked 64th by that time. Of course, that assumes we keep the shitty healthcare system we have now, with the average individual expected to live 79.8 years. So for people born today, if we stay with the same healthcare system, that healthcare system is projected to cost them 6 full years of life compared to the expectation for the citizens of Spain. 6 full years, okay, of life, suggesting that those Americans who have just had a baby should immediately move to Spain, or who are expecting a baby should immediately move to Spain. So, what's the problem? If we're spending more money, why aren't we living longer, healthier lives? Well, roughly 28.5 million Americans still lack health insurance, which means far more people go without health care coverage in the United States than any other similar country. In fact, the number of people with health insurance here in the U.S. is actually on a decline because of Republican efforts to weaken the Affordable Care Act. Moreover, even people with health care coverage often strain to afford the care they need due to the inadequacy of the coverage offered. That's called the underinsurance problem. And when you combine it with the people who are completely uninsured, the total number of Americans who don't have the health care coverage they need reached 87 million people in 2019. Plenty of people with health insurance plans, even good employer-based coverage, are often forced to pay thousands of dollars in deductibles and co-payments out of their own pocket if they need medical care. Under the Affordable Care Act, for example, the average individual deductible was over $6,000 for a bronze plan in 2017, and the average family deductible was nearly $12,400. In an unexpected medical emergency, those individuals or families would have to pay up to $6,000 or $12,400 respectively. And remember how 40% of Americans report they'd have trouble finding an extra $400 for a sudden crisis? Question mark. According to the Census Bureau, healthcare-related expenses forced 8 million people into poverty in 2018. That's happening every year, not just 2018. There's no figure here for 2019, but you want to bet it was another 8 million in 2019? And you want to bet it's going to be another 8 million in 2020? Research indicates that 137 million Americans have faced tough choices due to medical debt in just the past year. Moreover, medical debt is the top reason people give for cashing out their retirement accounts, linking the healthcare deficit back to the savings deficit. Nearly 1 American in 4 reported skipping doctor visits due to costs, and nearly 1 in 5 did not purchase the medications that were prescribed for them for the same reason. As a result, many people who are considered insured must go without the care they need. The typical insurance also often doesn't cover certain crucial forms of care, like vision, hearing, or mental health, or dental. And many other people go untreated because their health conditions fall into those holes in their coverage. Like, for example, why do I have missing teeth gaps in my smile? Well, no dental insurance. Another telling example of the underinsurance problem comes from the policy analyst, Matt Brunig. His findings show that if the Republicans had succeeded in annulling the Affordable Care Act in 2017, 540,000 people would have died over the next decade because they would have lacked health care coverage. But an additional 320,000 would die from lack of coverage, even if the Republican effort was unsuccessful. In other words, an additional 320,000 would have died even if the Republican effort was unsuccessful and the Affordable Care Act was applied. Still, 32,000 people per year would die, according to Matt's estimate. But Matt's estimate is certainly an underestimate, because with all people losing jobs from the coronavirus crisis, and with the further weakening of the Affordable Care Act, there are undoubtedly 40 to 45 million people today who don't have insurance under the Affordable Care Act right now. And that means that in terms of fatalities due to lack of health insurance, we're probably up to 50,000 fatalities per year right now. because 1 in 786 people who don't have health insurance die. That's the ratio. That's the odds ratio. Okay, that applies. So do the arithmetic. 1 out of 786. Divide 45 million, the likely number of uninsured as of this date, by 786, and see what you come out with. That's an important point. Even under Obamacare, millions of Americans are still uninsured. When Obamacare, when 2017 started, at the start of 2017, it was estimated that 30 million people were uncovered by Obamacare. Okay. It was more like 32 million at that time. And since then, the Republicans have worked assiduously and somewhat successfully to weaken Obamacare. So the number of uninsured has steadily grown since that time. Even before COVID, it had grown to 37 million. Add it all up, and it shouldn't be surprising. The U.S. still lags well behind similar developed countries in access to care, even after passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2010. The Affordable Care Act was a Band-Aid on the problem. It did not solve the problem. It was the Band-Aid of Nancy Pelosi and Obama. That's what they did. They passed a Band-Aid because they wanted to save the health insurance market and they wanted to save the pharmaceutical companies. And they sacrificed lives to do that. Lives to do that. Thousands of lives per year. Over the decade since Obamacare was passed, there have been more than 400,000 fatalities. More than 400,000. Our healthcare deficits leads to lost time for work and for play, but also to the worst lost time of all, the years with friends and loved ones that so many people lose because they die too soon. At the very least, we know from MMT that our failure to provide proper insurance and care for every American isn't because the government can't afford to cover the cost. By settling for a system that provides coverage through a fractured web of private insurers, employer plans, and patchwork government programs, we've created a system of bottlenecks in which hospitals, providers, drug companies, and the private insurance companies would squeeze us for every last dollar, and in which bigger profits lie in making it harder for people to access care. If we're going to set up a system where everyone has a right to the health care they need, we'll have to make sure we have the real resources to do it. Financing isn't a constraint. The real resources are. Closing the healthcare deficit will require more primary care doctors, nurses, dentists, surgeons, hospital beds, the medical equipment, and so on. To properly care for all our people, we'll have to build more hospitals and community health centers, invest more heavily in medical research, and create an economy where training the next generation of doctors and nurses isn't going to bury Americans in debt, which leads us to yet another deficit in U.S. life we need to solve, the education deficit. We have disparities in education that start in preschool and persist through high school and beyond. We have a credentialing system that lures students into a seemingly endless pursuit of college degrees, And this ties into the good jobs deficit as employers demand higher education backgrounds for more and more jobs that used to not need them. The savings deficit also bleeds into the education deficit. Millions of students can't afford spiraling college costs, and the giant mountain of student debt that results is a huge drag on our economy. Our education deficit begins early, starting with preschool. Stephanie goes through preschool here, and that's a significant strain on a typical working family, costing $9,120 annually or $760 per month. The Obama administration makes some headway on this issue by proposing preschool for all and creating a federal-state partnership to fund high-quality preschools for 4-year-olds from low to middle-income families. And then she talks about the preschool development, the grant Birth Through 5 program. Over 28,000 students was served in improved preschool classroom settings in 18 states. Obama signed the Every Student Succeeds Act on ESSA in December 2015, a bipartisan law that brought help to high-need students and families while solidifying the previously mentioned investments in high-quality preschools. Unfortunately, Trump has repeatedly talked of overturning the ESSA and cutting the Obama-era education programs. Then she talks about the K through 12 level. Most funding for schools comes from local property taxes, and she talks about the property tax revenue in poor rural Mississippi is obviously vastly different than in Greenwich, Connecticut. And the quality of schools in both places reflect this. She talks about the damage extending to sports programs even, and that public high school teams had a record of 0 to 104 against their counterparts in the wealthy suburbs. I think she's talking about, in the last decade, in Des Moines, in Iowa, 17-year-old senior Dustin Hagler commented, "It's hard when you lose, but it's not just losing. It's hard not to feel beaten down, like the odds are stacked against you," unquote. That makes football America for American schooling writ large, and Hagler's sense of defeat likely describes how disadvantaged kids across the country feel when they simply don't have the same resources available to their peers in wealthier school districts. And Stephanie then gives some statistics that measure the deficit in our education system and how it's continued into higher education. She talks about tuition in private four-year institutions, that in 1987 to 88 it was $15,160. By 2017, 2018, that cost had more than doubled. And she says tuition for public institutions showed similar trends. It was 1987 to 1988. It was $3,190, but it had risen to $9,970 in the 2018 school year, and that's for public institutions. How much did public institutions cost when I went to college in 1955? Well, City College was free, at that time. And the state university schools that just were starting out, at that time were something like tuition was $30 a year or $60 a year or something ridiculous like that. Even when I taught at SUNY Binghamton during the 1970s, and at SUNY Buffalo as well, during the 1970s, but tuition there was, I don't know, probably a couple $100 a semester. It was very low. Tuition hikes have led to a national student debt crisis. The average borrower from the class of 2017 now owes $28,650. Stephanie goes on, in that vein, talking about student debts. In total, a higher education deficit has left 45 million Americans burdened with student debt. The official figure for delinquent student loans reached $166 billion in the fourth quarter of 2018. But the Federal Reserve Bank of New York estimates that as much as $1/3 trillion in student loans may have gone delinquent during that time. What do you suppose the figure is now that young people have been subjected to the interruption of the economy due to COVID? What do you think has happened with their student loans? Stephanie continues, points out that many people owe well in excess of 100,000. Okay. And on and on. We have told young people the way to climb the income ladder is go to college. This is the pathway to higher lifetime earnings and more financial security. That is no longer true. You need a college degree just to hold on to the rungs. Without it, you risk falling down the income ladder. The problem is that earnings aren't rising for people with college degrees. In fact, for 60% of college graduates, their wages today are lower than in 2000. Basically, incomes for college graduates are stuck in real terms where they were 2 or 3 decades ago. While the costs of attending college have risen dramatically in real terms, so we're breaking our backs, piling on debt in the belief this is how you get ahead. In fact, this is how you run in place. What can MMT contribute as a way out of the education deficit? Most K-12 funding comes from local property taxes. MMT's lens also shows how we could easily and quickly retire all student debt. Also, we'll see in the final chapter how money can be channeled through grants from federal government programs, helping make state and university systems tuition free, or at least much more affordable than they are now. Of course, Bernie's program is tuition free. The MMT lens also shows how we could easily and quickly retire all student debt through the federal government, freeing up income that could be spent back into the economy, creating millions of new private sector jobs. Finally, the twin trends of stagnating wages coupled with increasing education requirements and job applications both result from employers holding all the cards. With MMT tools, we can restore full employment in tight labor markets, helping return bargaining clout to workers. As with the other deficits we've examined, when we stop asking, how are we going to pay for it, and examine the issue through the MMT lens, solutions and hope are not just possible, but palpable. And next, Stephanie goes on to discuss the infrastructure deficit. And I'm not going to go through all that, but I do want to emphasize one thing. Okay. She mentions floods and bridge failings, of course, and she gives some examples of people who were caught up, in the disasters. What I want to point to is that we've fallen so far behind in our infrastructure that the American Society of Civil Engineers gives a D+ grade to our infrastructure. By the way, they've been giving that D+ grade for years, since 2011 or 2012 at least. They estimate it will take $4.59, that's $4.6 trillion over a 10-year period to get it up to appropriate standards. That estimate does not include financing costs. I think due to financing costs, there's at least another $600 billion there. We're probably talking about $5.2 trillion if we take 10 years to finance, even if we take 6 years to finance it. Okay, I don't know why we do it over 10 years. I don't know why we wouldn't do it over 6 years. That update would earn America's infrastructure, would earn us a grade of B, which the ASC defines the system or network as in good to excellent condition. Some elements show signs of general deterioration that are going to require attention. That's only a B. The ASC concluded our most serious infrastructure weaknesses include aviation, drinking water, energy, waste management, levees, roads, schools, and other forms of infrastructure critical to our health, our well-being, and our future prosperity. In other words, the Flint water crisis, which occurred in 2014, is the tip of the iceberg. Then she goes on to mention Newark, New Jersey, and bad drinking water there. And she mentions the state of New Jersey received a D plus grade, consistent with the United States as a whole. And she points out left out of recent ASCE reports is perhaps our most basic infrastructure need, affordable quality housing. Lying within the infrastructure deficit is also a national housing deficit. And she quotes researcher Peter Gowan and journalist Ryan Cooper studying that problem of housing, particularly for people who rent, and found the situation has become even worse since 2008. They wrote, the number of burdened renters remains substantially above its pre-crisis level. In 2007, 8 million households spend 30 to 50% of their income on rent. In 2017, that number was 9.8 million. In 2007, 9 million households spent 50% or more of their income on rent. In 2017, that number was at 11 million. These burdened renters paying 30% of their income or more on rent now account for 47% of all renters. This shortfall in basic infrastructure is robbing poor families of safe and healthy places to live. Most families who rent spend more than the recommended 30% of their income on housing. Local zoning and construction laws also hold back construction of new housing supply, raising prices in the process. On top of it all, families' inability to secure affordable housing even helps drive the education deficit. The wealthier the school district your home is in, the higher quality of school your children attend. The housing deficit that historically affected African Americans also persists. Black ownership in today's America is nearly the same as it was during times when housing discrimination was legal. In other words, we've accomplished nothing in certain areas. Stephanie goes on to describe that and the redlining by the Federal Housing Administration. And she said that was justified by the Federal Housing Administration's theory that African Americans purchased homes in the suburbs, the property values would decline, and the whites' homes they were insuring would decrease in values. And the racism of Americans and their desire to keep their home values up combined in a self-justifying feedback loop. The Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968 to permit African Americans to buy homes in these, quote, white neighborhoods. But in the 2015 statistic, the black home ownership rate was 33% for 35 to 44-year-olds, lower than in the 1960s when housing discrimination was legal and segregation was still promoted by FHA policy. Any effort to address our housing deficit thus must boldly address the ugly legacy of racial discrimination, which has restricted access to affordable homes and better funded school districts. Simply put, we can do much more than we are doing now. Carrying a grade of D+ is disgraceful for a nation that strives for greatness. And, by the way, disgraceful for a nation that strives for human rights and that strives to fulfill the Economic Bill of Rights. We need to retrofit business and homes with sustainable sources of energy, build affordable housing for all our people, repair structurally deficient bridges, blanket the nation with high-speed rail, fix our airports, shore up our levees, dams, sewage, and water systems, and more. Building this infrastructure will increase our convenience, save lives, boost the nation's long-term productivity, and increase equality of opportunity, not to mention provide many of the good-paying jobs needed to close the jobs deficit. MMT's new lands could empower our politicians to be more proactive when it comes to channeling investment. A good example is Senator Warren's affordable housing plan, which she proposed during her campaign to win the nomination for president, to invest $500 billion over the next decade in building, rehabbing, and preserving low-income units. I believe that's too little, by the way. I prefer Bernie Sanders' plan. Again, it is never money the federal government lacks to address needs like infrastructure and housing. Real resources are the actual constraint, and there's no reason to think America is on the verge of running out of concrete, steel, wood, or metals. In fact, when it comes to housing, we actually have far more empty homes than we have homeless Americans. The materials are there. We have simply failed to send the money where it needs to go, and we've allowed the money to go where it isn't needed because we remain shackled by the deficit myth and by our racism and our meanness and our lack of imagination and our okay. Next deficit, the climate deficit. All the deficits we've covered so far exist among us as Americans. But just as no man is an island, neither is any one country or society or even the whole human race. Neither America nor the global community of nations can sustain themselves without a livable planet, without clean air and water, fertile soil, stable weather, dependable temperatures, or healthy ecosystems. Which brings us to the climate deficit. The science indicates that to avoid the worst climate change scenarios, we need to limit global warming over this century to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Current plans, however, would only limit the temperature rise to 3 or 4 degrees Celsius above that threshold. We can't survive at 3 or 4 degrees Celsius above that threshold. What happens if we fail to close the gaps between where we are and where we need to be? The latest reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, paint a dire picture. Rising sea levels, more drastic flooding, more severe droughts, stronger storms and hurricanes, and heat waves leading to many more deaths. Many coastal cities and communities around the world could become unlivable, and significant climate pattern shifts could upend crops and fresh water supplies, leading to hundreds of millions of new climate refugees. Disease, famine, infrastructure failure, and economic crises will all become worse around the world. In other words, making worse the previous gaps. We would lose ground in all the other areas because we failed to cope with the climate gap. Just the distance between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees would have major consequences. It would expose 30% of all humans to extreme heat once every 5 years, as opposed to 14% under 1.5 degrees, of warming. What's that going to do to life expectancy, folks? Rising sea levels would put an additional 10 million people in danger. And overall, 700 million additional human beings would be at some climate-related risk by 2050. If we succeed in limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, we will still witness the death of an estimated 70% to 90% of all coral reefs around the world as oceans absorb more of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and become more acidic. Should the planet warm by 2 degrees or more, essentially all of the coral in the world will die off and all of the life that sustains itself on the coral. As for 3 degrees or more of warming, about 550,000 Americans in over 300,000 homes on today's coastlines could face chronic inundation. By the way, these are all underestimates from studies that have tried to be conservative so the scientists will be believed. But these studies are unreliable. They always turn out to be underestimates. As we move forward towards increased warming, the reality is always worse than has been projected by the scientists. Anyway, we could face chronic inundation by 2045, meaning flooding that happens more or less every other week. Say goodbye to Miami. By the end of the century, and New York maybe too, those numbers would rise to 4.7 million people in 2.4 million homes, which is roughly the amount you'd get if you combined all the homes in Los Angeles and Houston. Take a specific example. Oh, by the way, Houston would probably go too. Take a specific example. Charleston, South Carolina could see tidal floods increase more than tenfold from 11 per year in 2014 to 180 per year in 2045. In July of 2019, Alaska's summertime heat hit an all-time record of 90 degrees Fahrenheit. By the way, in Siberia, it just hit an all-time record of 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. If business as usual, global warming continues, that kind of record breaker will become more commonplace. By 2050, certain regions and cities in America will suffer month-long heat waves and stretches of summer days so hot it will be dangerous to go outdoors. Rainfall and precipitation will come in greater bursts and longer absences, instead of being more evenly spread out. California, for instance, has rocketed between flooding and drought-fueled wildfires just in 2019, and the whiplash between heavy rains and severe stretches of no rain at all is projected to become more intense. This will put even greater pressure on water supplies that are already stressed. Research indicates 96 of the 204 basins supplying the U.S. with fresh water could fail to meet the monthly demand by 2071. Meanwhile, half the global population will live in water-stressed areas by 2025, the World Health Organization estimates. Imagine what would happen to local industries as diverse as agriculture and ski resorts if the weather patterns they've relied on shift drastically in the coming decades, or what U.S. cities and states that are already facing water shortages will do when supplies dwindle even further. Across the world, heat waves and dust storms have gotten worse, colder weather areas have shrunk, deserts have expanded, and drought has expanded to another 1% of land every year from 1961 to 2013. Already, agriculture in Europe is getting hammered by heat waves, and American agriculture is enduring heavy spring and summer floods. If warming continues, major farming regions across the world could simultaneously endure multiple breadbasket failure, according to Cynthia Rosenzweig, a senior NASA scientist and a contributing author to one of the IPCC reports. Nathan Holtman at Brookings has a useful analogy. During the last ice age, when the global temperature was between 4 and 7 degrees Celsius colder than today, the city of Chicago was under half a mile of ice, meaning a few degrees difference globally can lead to vast changes in climate and weather and ecosystems. If we don't deviate from our current course, the global population is going to experience a 3 or 4 degree change in the opposite direction. In other words, whatever the hotter world equivalent is of a mountain of ice atop one of America's biggest cities, we're heading for the low end of the warming range that would make that world a reality. Careless human activity is punishing ecosystems in other ways as well, and climate change would exacerbate the damage. Thanks to overfishing, ocean wildlife of all kinds is already half as abundant as it was in 1970, according to a 2015 report by the Worldwide Fund for Nature and the Zoological Society of London. Unabated climate change will kill still more as ocean temperatures and acidity rise. We'll also face a potential mass die-off in world insect populations, which are falling by 2.5% per year, according to 2019 analysis. A third of species are endangered and 40% are in decline. The main culprit is the clear-cutting and pesticide use involved in human agriculture, which itself links back to climate change through land use. That rising temperatures in various regions are also speeding along the deaths of insect species that can't adapt quickly enough. You can imagine the consequences for global biodiversity, farming industry, and food supplies if sea life and insect life continue to collapse. When burned, the fossil fuels that release carbon dioxide also release soot, ozone, other pollutants, and other particulate matter, which kills significant numbers of people by exacerbating cardiovascular disease and other health effects. The particulate matter alone causes up to 30,000 premature deaths per year, as of a 2014 estimate. Limiting emissions to 1.5 degrees of warming instead of 2 degrees would also prevent pollution from killing 150 million people worldwide by 2100, particularly in major urban areas of Asia and Africa. By the way, that's certainly an underestimate, that 150 million people killed. Finally, national and global inequality will put some people more directly in climate change's crosshairs. In the last 2 decades, 4.2 billion people have already suffered from weather-related disasters, and those in developing and low-income countries are the hardest hit. Sadly, the people at greater risk from climate hazards are the poor, the vulnerable, and the marginalized, who in many cases have been excluded from socioeconomic progress, unquote, as former United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon noted. Here in America, low-income African Americans endured the most hardships and losses when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, and they had the hardest time recovering. Of course, global warming may not destroy human civilization, but the most likely business as usual scenarios do suggest global poverty reduction could be set back decades, which intrinsically means hundreds of millions of additional deaths. But then that's assuming the consensus of the IPCC reports isn't significantly underestimating the danger. These are only the most likely scenarios. We may be underestimating, I think we're almost surely underestimating, the cascade effects and feedback loops, meaning there's a small but real chance that business as usual will lead to far more catastrophic results. We're already at 1 degree warming and seeing some significant impacts, Holtman wrote, summing up the IPCC's conclusions. Quote, 1.5 degrees is going to have more severe impacts. And by the way, 1.5 degrees, according to the IPCC, is already baked in. We may not be at that level of warming yet, but it's baked in. Whatever we do, we will do well just to get to 1.5 degrees. Anyway, she says, it's going to have more severe impacts. 2 degrees has more, and we probably don't want to test what happens above 2 degrees, though our current momentum appears to have us on a trajectory for about a 3 degree or more world. That's what Holtman wrote. To hit the 1.5 degree target, the world will need to cut its fossil fuel use in half by 2030 and eliminate all fossil fuel consumption by 2050. Stated bluntly, this required a total overhaul of U.S. and global civilization, the way we practice agriculture and use land, the way we generate energy, the way we design our cities and transit. All will require extensive changes. We'll need to drastically increase the efficiency with which our homes, buildings, factories, transportation systems, and everything else use energy, which will require a sweeping deployment of the latest technologies both here in America and abroad. On top of that, we'll have to completely revamp our national infrastructure to improve climate resilience and to electrify all forms of energy use, from cars to home heating to heavy industry. We'll also need a massive build-out of solar, wind, storage, and other investments so that all our electricity comes from renewables done as fast as possible. The United States also bears special responsibility in this regard. We're the world's second largest producer of greenhouse gas emissions at 15% to China's 25%, while America's per person emissions are more than double China's. This sweeping renewal of American society is possible. The IPCC and other scientists conclude both the changes needed here in the U.S. and globally can be accomplished more or less with technology already available. Again, if we realize the limit is real resources, not money or the burden of the national deficit, we can see that closing the climate deficit is possible if we act fast. Furthermore, all the work needed to close the climate deficit will help close the good jobs deficit in efforts to shore up our communities and cities against the ravages of climate change would be part and parcel of closing the infrastructure deficit. The Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change, MCC, runs a carbon clock counting down the days until humanity has emitted all the greenhouse gases it can afford and still stay under 2 degrees of warming. It's similar to the U.S. national debt clock mounted in New York City, displaying the historical record of prior deficit spending. But unlike the national debt clock, The MCC's carbon clock is tracking a deficit that actually matters. As of this writing, and at current rates of emission, we have a little less than 26 years to solve our climate deficit, which means, by the way, that we have to start to solve it right now. Next is the democracy deficit. You might think there couldn't possibly be any deficit more consequential than the fate of the global climate that sustains human civilization. But there's one more gap in American life that, while not necessarily greater in scope, cuts even deeper, because this deficit is the reason for all our other deficits. It's why we perpetually fail to generate enough good jobs, why so many of us go without adequate healthcare or education, why we pushed our planetary ecology to the brink of collapse, all seemingly without care. It's a deficit between the few and the many, between the powerful and the powerless, between those with voice and those without. It's our democracy deficit. As much as democracy rests on rights and values and constitutions, the democracy deficit begins once more with resources, with who has money and wealth and influence and leverage and who does not. Remember that MMT says the government deficit is always someone else's surplus. And in the U.S. in recent decades, as the government deficit has increased, dollars has flowed disproportionately into the pockets of the wealthy, creating vast distances between them and the rest of America. Such economic inequality is hardly new to America, but in recent years it's risen to heights not seen since the Gilded Age and the robber barons. Consider the Gini coefficient, a measure of income inequality that economists often rely on. Okay, a Gini coefficient of 0 would mean a perfectly egalitarian economy, while a coefficient of 1 means that one person literally gets all the income generated. No country experiences either extreme, but the World Economic Forum reports that among the advanced and long-term developed countries, none has a higher Gini coefficient than the United States. And our rapidly expanding disparities show no signs of abasement. Yet, many might ask, what's the problem? The U.S. economy seems to be doing well by any number of other measures. So I don't think we'd say that now in the middle of the COVID crisis, would we? Isn't inequality just the way of the world? Isn't it a natural outgrowth of dynamism and creative power in our land of opportunity? Doesn't the law of princely sums spur people to heights of creativity and achievement, benefiting us all in the process? In short, does inequality really matter? Stephanie answers, and I answer too. Yes, it does. The economic realm is not separable from the social realm and the political realm. Income and wealth are both measures of the political power and social clout human beings possess. If the first is unequally distributed, the second is unequally distributed as well. Income provides people material essentials, but decent pay and decent hours also give people time and stability to participate in family and community. And I might add politics. A well-known fact in social science is that social capital, a technical term for communal bonds like membership in clubs, attending church, being married, interacting with one's neighbors, also increases noticeably with wealth and income. Research shows that overworked Americans are more likely to feel isolated and alienated as human beings. It's been showing this for a very, very long time. While the share of income going to the top 1% has doubled since 1980, the share going to the bottom 50% has fallen from more than 20% to just 13%. President Trump may boast the boom times, but the reality is that half of all Americans live paycheck to paycheck, while 40 million live in poverty. 1 child in 5 lives in poverty. Poverty, with its unending psychological stress, its food insecurity, and its exposure to pollution and lead and also disease, does enormous damage to human beings of all ages, and especially to children whose mental and physical development is permanently impacted, leaving them trapped in cycles and suffering that are very difficult to escape. Simply put, poverty strips people of the opportunities to flourish, to participate in the American dream. Wealth is just as fundamental to questions of power and democracy as income. If you have significant ownership stakes in a company, for instance, you get to decide how it invests, whether it outsources, and whether it creates low wage employment or quality jobs with good wages and benefits. If you own real estate in a neighborhood, you have immense power over whether people in that neighborhood can afford housing and their utility bills, not to mention sway over the course of the neighborhood's economic development. Who does and does not own property, and thus who gets to decide what happens to the property, is really the heart of the gentrification problem, for instance. People with great wealth essentially get to decide the fate of their fellow citizens' livelihoods. As of 2016, the wealthiest 10% of U.S. households command more than 70% of all wealth in the country. Meanwhile, the top 1% controlled almost 40%, a larger share than they've posted at any point since 1929, just before the Great Depression. When they become extreme, inequalities in wealth and income begin to widen inequalities in the political realm, which is exactly what has happened. The rich and powerful, I added that, the rich and powerful can attend high-dollar fundraisers, maxing out contributions that give them access and influence over the political process. Meanwhile, millions disengage, convinced that their voices and their votes don't even matter. More than 80% of Americans who make more than $150,000 a year voted in the 2012 election, but just 40% of those making less than $10,000 cast a ballot. This trend extends back through 2010 and 2008 as well. About half of eligible voters did not participate in the 2016 election. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for example, saw the worst turnout in 16 years, and the fall off in voter participation from 2012 to 2016 was much more severe in the city's poorest neighborhoods. And the New York Times asked Cedric Fleming, a local barber scraping by and struggling with expensive health premiums, why so many didn't vote in the 2016 election. His response was blunt. Quote, Milwaukee was tired. Both of them were terrible. They never do anything for us anyway, unquote. Drive around many major cities and you'll see struggling neighborhoods with people barely scraping by, rundown buildings, an absence of grocery stores, and so on. Travel a short distance, you might enter a neighborhood with multi-million-dollar homes or swanky apartments with uniformed doormen, its inhabitants living a completely different kind of life. Homeless people line the streets of New York, San Francisco, and LA on blocks where the bars and restaurants roar with money. Professional athletes sign multi-million-dollar contracts. Every tweak and twinge in their bodies is instantly attended by top specialists, while millions of Americans cannot afford even basic health insurance. CEOs who have failed miserably in their jobs are given multi-million-dollar severance packages, while ordinary people are left picking up the pieces of the economy these CEOs have destroyed. When we look at rural America, it too has been heavily impacted by our economic inequities. While oil companies, Walmart, Amazon, college football coaches, and televangelists have prospered, and by the way, are being bailed out now, small towns have been gutted. Shuttered storefronts, unemployment, impoverished school districts, and drugs have become part of a tragic story of today's small towns and inner cities. A recent article in The Nation profiled rural America's hidden homeless, people like Holly Phelps, an ex-convict and single mother who landed in Marion, Illinois with her two daughters. Phelps worked at a laundromat but couldn't afford a place to live. Her mother, an alcoholic, lived over an hour away. Quote, I had no healthy place to go. I didn't know whether I was coming or going. I was keeping my stuff in a shed, and no one understood what I was going through, unquote, she says. Because she wasn't sleeping on the streets or in a shelter, she was not considered homeless, even though her family had no secure place to sleep every night. After the 2016 election, Anthony Rice, an African-American man living in Youngstown, Ohio, told by journalist and photographer Chris Arnatti that most in this neighborhood, quote unquote, sat out of the election, quote again, we didn't have a dog in this fight, unquote. Rice said he voted for Clinton but he, quote, don't mind Trump, unquote. Nor did Trump's win surprise him. Quote, Obama promised a lot and only a little came of it. Maybe New York City got some promises actually delivered. This street here is still filled with homes falling down, unquote. Quote, nobody helps us out here. We get thrown in jail, unquote. Another older gentleman in Bakersfield, California, told Arnatti, quote, people we have in office are criminals and protect their big friends who are also criminals. We out on the streets, voters, we suffer, unquote. Americans who don't make a lot simply don't feel that their stories and struggles register with the policymakers and politicians in government, or that participation in U.S. democracy is even worth bothering with. They may well be right. A striking political science paper in 2014 found that while there's a fair amount of overlap between political preferences of everyday Americans and the political preferences of rich elites, when the two sets of interests diverge, it's almost invariably the rich whose desires are served by the political system. Functionally, the participation of most Americans in a democracy often seems irrelevant, which raises the question of whether meaningful democracy is even possible in a country with such vast economic inequities. Democrats often complain the problem with the wealthiest Americans is that they're not, quote, paying their fair share of taxes, unquote. Taxes are definitely part of the story, but they're far from the whole story. MMT does not take the Robin Hood approach of taxing the rich to give to the poor. As we've seen, our federal taxes don't pay for anything, including raising anyone's standard of living. At the same time, the myth that Uncle Sam's deficit is cause for concern helps drive our very real democracy deficit. If our elected leaders believe they must either go begging to the rich before they can spend money on the public good, or that they must fight the rich for that same money, then, of course, the foibles and tics of quixotic political desires of our richest citizens will become the primary obsession of our government. But taxes are important in other ways. As the World Inequality Report notes, quote, the income inequality trajectory observed in the United States, unquote, is partially explained by, quote, a tax system that grew less progressive, unquote. Taxes can be used to curb astronomical accumulations of wealth. That's important precisely because the wealth use their money to amass power and influence over the political process. They've rigged the tax code in their favor. They've rewritten labor laws, trade agreements, rules governing patents, protections, and much more. They've remade public policy to serve their economic interests. This is why so many of our companies pay out enormous piles of cash to shareholders and upper management, smaller sums to the well-educated upper class, and a pittance to everyone else. It's why Silicon Valley has gleaming skyscrapers in downtown San Francisco, but working-class communities in Flint, Michigan don't have access to water that isn't poisonous. It's why our welfare state and healthcare system and retirement system are all in shambles, and why we're staring down the barrel of an unaddressed climate crisis. The profits and power the wealthy elites can find in not addressing these problems are just so much greater than the profits and power to be found in addressing them. During the widely shared economic boom just after World War II, when U.S. inequality was at its lowest ebb, there were no fewer than 24 tax brackets. The top tax bracket would apply to all individual household income over $1,900,000 in 2013 dollars was 91%. The point of these tax rates wasn't to fund government spending, of course. It was to put a cap on the amount of money any one person or family could extract from the shared and interdependent economic activity of all Americans. Strengthening the progressivity of our tax code is a critical part of what is needed to reverse the decades-long trends in income and wealth inequality. But taxing the rich isn't enough. And I might add, it's not even necessary to do that first. These extraordinary concentrations of wealth and income threaten to tear society apart. To restore a more balanced distribution of wealth and income, we need policies to prevent a tiny handful of people at the very top from taking so much more than their fair share in the first place. As former Labor Secretary Robert Reich has written, we need a slate of policies aimed at pre-distribution at least as much as we need conventional taxation and the redistribution. We must thoroughly reform our labor laws to strengthen the unions and do away with the capricious leverage employers wield over employees through things like um, um, mandatory arbitration and non-compete agreements. We can also remake licensing and intellectual property law to cut down oligarchs and corporations' use of those laws to stifle competition and siphon money from the rest of us. As we must drive workers' wages and benefits and bargaining power back up by making it easier for workers to collectively bargain and by sustaining the kind of tight labor laws we saw during World War II to things like a job guarantee and public investment and better macroeconomic policy. Until we do so, a democracy deficit will leave us with an education system, with quote, education system in which you can buy admissions, a political system in which you can buy Congress, a justice system in which you can buy your way out of jail, unquote, and, quote again, a healthcare system in which you can buy care others can't, unquote. Beyond the democracy deficit, there are practical economic consequences to America's yawning inequality chasm. Imagine if rising inequality continued unabated until only a tiny handful of people literally did have it all. The economy would collapse as there wouldn't be enough people with income to keep our businesses afloat. Companies would go under, and eventually only a few people would be employed building yachts for the wealthy, working as their groundskeepers or flying them around in their private jets. 2015 study by the IMF already found that an increase in the income share of the bottom 20%, the poor, is associated with higher GDP growth, while GDP growth actually declines when the income share of the top 20%, the rich, increases. If you increase the income of poor people, they generally consume more, spending that money right back into the economy. Conversely, we see that more income to the rich results in more stock market purchases and savings rather than money flowing back into the economy. So much for trickle down. For a quarter century after World War II, Americans' real hourly wages rose in tandem with increases in worker productivity. This was reflected in widely shared prosperity and an underlying sense that hard work and personal integrity were rewarded and that you could get ahead. Then the Reagan Revolution, so-called, of 1980, inaugurated an era of unbridled greed, lowering taxes for the wealthy, cutting the regulations on corporations, and accelerating war on workers' rights to organize and earn a livable wage. Particularly after 1980, a yawning gap has opened up between productivity and wages. Productivity continues on its steady upward trend, but wages do not. They grow modestly, if at all. If the hourly pay rate had followed the same growth as productivity from 1973 to 2014, there would have been no rise in income inequality during that period. Where has all that increased productivity gone? It was skimmed off at the top. Back in 1950, the average S&P 500 CEO made 20 times as much as the average worker. By 2017, the average CEO at an S&P 500 corporation was making 361 times as much as the average worker. Since 1980, the global 1% has captured twice as much growth as the bottom 15%. 25 people have as much wealth as 50% of the country's population. Just 3 people, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and Warren Buffett, own more wealth than the bottom half of Americans, some 160 million people. Workers certainly created new wealth over the last 4 decades, but they did not get to share in it because the democracy deficit can be found within American companies as well. Many of our firms are now feudal economic fiefdoms in which a small group of wealthy owners extract value from the labor of vast numbers of everyday Americans. The true road to serfdom, by the way, not what Hayek says, but what Hayek actually recommended, turns out was the true road to serfdom. By helping us see government spending in a new light, MMT gives us many more options when we think about how we might address economic inequality and the democracy deficit, not just by taxing the rich, but by investing in the kinds of programs that will actually raise the standard of living for low and middle income Americans. Democracy means that we all have a voice, that we all have a say, and that we all matter. We need a politics that recognizes that and restores the fundamental equation in democratic society, one person, one vote. And we must restore it in the economic realm as much as the political realm, because the two are ultimately inseparable. The Constitution places the power of the purse in the hands of Congress, our elected representatives. But in practice, the fiscal deficit myth has prevented Congress from using that power to fix the real deficits hobbling our economy by shifting the discussion of budgeting from its focus on debt and deficits to one that focuses on the deficits that matter. MMT gives us the power to imagine a new politics and a new economy, moving us from a narrative of scarcity to one, of opportunity. So I got through the chapter. I'll now move to your comments. Again, I think this was an excellent chapter. I don't think I necessarily accept the end conclusion that we're in this situation just because of the deficit myth. I think the deficit myth has been very useful for those who wanted to increase their wealth and who wanted to increase their power and who joined with technocrats during the 1970s to use the CBO and the doctrine of fiscal responsibility and the beginnings, of neoliberalism to shackle the Congress and to overcome the legacy of the Green New Deal. In other words, as always, there's an interaction between the material conditions of society, the power conditions in society, and the ideas, and ideologies that are brought forth into society. The deficit myth is a big part of what has happened to us. And as we get rid of that, we're in a more powerful position to change things. However, the deficit myth isn't the primary cause. Well, I'm not even going to judge whether it's the primary cause or not. It's an important cause, but just as important is the power structure currently existing, which in part has been fed by the deficit myth, but which exists independently and which allows people to ignore the deficit myth. Not simply Stephanie, but many of us have been arguing against the deficit myth and other fiscal myths for many, many years now, more than a decade, more than 15 years, more than 20 years, with slowly growing effectiveness. But increasingly, over the last 10 years, our voices have been getting louder and more widely accepted. But even when our voices have managed to remove the belief people had in the doctrines, of neoliberalism, even when we were able to successfully persuade people that neoliberalism had failed and that neoliberalism was at fault in the recession of 2007 and 2008, still the neoliberals have been able to push forward their austerity agendas since that time, even as people realized that the neoliberal emperor had no clothes, had no ideological clothes, They knew austerity was unjustified. They knew the emphasis on faux fiscal responsibility, including pay-go, even though people knew that that was a false emphasis and one which we had to give up, it was still the case that they would not look into MMT in detail, that they would not try to learn alternative ideas that would free them up. They would not buy the books that were out there in great quantity. They would not take the trouble to read them. They would follow the old progressive formulas of just trying to fight with the wealthy over taxation so they could spend on certain things. And while fighting this battle, they were still subjected by the neoliberals to naked power, bereft of ideological justification through their manipulation of the institutions of government here in the United States, the institutions of the Senate, the institutions of the Congress, the seniority system in the Congress, the filibuster in the Senate, all of the delays that are built into our government, the stacking of the courts, all these things to thwart the progress that we needed. They still had their hands on the levers of power, and we've been able to do nothing about it up until this very day. Now, Stephanie's book is enormously important. We'll go through the final chapter next time. Hopefully, it will be enormously important for the coming argument. But as you all know, people in Congress are starting to think again about the next round of bailout from the COVID crisis. And the Republicans are posturing again about targeting the aid and about being worried about the debts again. And the Democrats are doing their own little dance about what kind of targeting they want. Essentially Nancy Pelosi wanting to retain what she had in the HEROES Act, the advantages for the lobby groups, to allow the lobby groups to be bailed out by the government. She wanted to have that in the HEROES Act, as if the lobbyists were the heroes of this particular situation. So the people in power have their priorities right now, and they're going to use austerity ideology, faux fiscal responsibility ideology. They're going to use that as much as they can, okay, in order to try to block the kind of relief from COVID that we need. But Stephanie has placed in our hands, through this book, a very popularly written book, that if we can get it into enough hands and if we can talk about it enough and get it spread enough over the next month or so, we can have an influence. We can have an influence on the debate in Congress. We can perhaps get to the point where people dare not plead poverty, where they dare not cry poor mouth, where they just have to nakedly advocate for their priorities and just say to us in the face of the upcoming election, we don't want to legislate for your interest because we don't care about you. I hope they do not actually decide in that way and they get something useful out of the new stimulus that may be coming. Maybe we will get something useful out of it. But I don't think we'll get much that's useful out of it because they're going to place their priorities ahead of our priorities. And they'll think if they give us a little something, okay, little crumbs, they'll be able to get everything that they want. And we have to be able to tell them, if you spend most of this stuff on what you want, or primarily on the things that you want for your cronies and the people you favor, you're all going to get kicked out in November. No matter how much you try to manipulate the system, because we know you're lying about the need to limit the deficit in this particular situation. We know you don't want to legislate for our interest, that you're only interested in doing right by you, and you don't care about the public purpose, and you don't care about our democracy. We have to be ready to say that in very rude ways to our representatives in the House, okay, and in the Senate. And we need to be prepared to back it up with votes that will throw them out in the fall. I'll now consider your comments. I apologize for taking so long. I don't have any of your early comments. My comment stream seems to start off at 10:18. Avril says, only if the delusional overtones of jingoistic superiority of American shatter. COVID will do that in time drastically. BB Bowman says, hi, Sandy. Hi, BB. Don't think I've seen you before. Welcome. Avril Mano says, same. Matt says, have you looked at the profits of the big health insurers under the ACA? It's an increasing monotonic function. Okay, an increasing monotonic function is, in common sense terms, okay, it's it's an increasing function in higher and higher rank orders. Okay, a monotonic function, okay, is a rank order function, okay, of increase. In other words, the degree, okay, of profits is increasing monotonically over time, getting greater and greater under the ACA. Sure, because there were no limits on the ACA prices. It was a neoliberal bill. There were no limits on what the business people could do. God forbid we should place any limits on business people. I mean, we can place all limits we want on the freaking government, but God forbid we should place any limits on business people. Sandy Degg, I hope we get more progressives and senators elected so we can get something done. Well, we got 2 more elected at least last night, and maybe a third too. Steve says we did pretty good yesterday. Sandy said, yes, we did. Sandy says, I hope New Jersey follows suit. I hope so too. Matt says, incrementalism has got to go. That's a losing strategy. We don't have enough time. We don't. We won't survive the climate crisis. Steve says, support Paula Jean Swearingen in West Virginia. Yes. Sandy says, Ham in New Jersey. Yes. And Russ Cirincione in New Jersey, too. Sandy says. I say. Sandy says, Ham, okay, in New Jersey. And Matt says, every time I hear Obama, I think of his water stunt in Flint. Unconscionable. It was unconscionable. And by the way, folks, Shahed Buttar in San Francisco, Steve says, support Shahed over Pelosi in San Francisco. Absolutely, Steve. Absolutely. Warren Chamberlain says Bernie Sanders is supporting all the progressive candidates through his campaign war chest. That's wonderful. That is wonderful. That's a great use for that war chest. If he insists on suspending his campaign, then that's the best use of his war chest at this point. I hope he's given some money to Shahed. Avril says, and alcohol overconsumption and smoking needs to stop because it keeps people enslaved to disease and big pharma and exploitation by the healthcare for profit industry. But unfortunately, it's celebrated, and even now with the legalization of weed, it's still harmful. But will people ever be sober enough to figure that out? Let's get them sober enough. Sandy says, Ham got a Sanders endorsement. Did Russ Cirincione get a Sanders endorsement? Because he really needs one, and he's an MMTer. Warren says there's no escape from reality, but all attempts to do so just make reality worse. Steve says, when I was young, community college was basically free. Yes. We took classes for fun, tennis, weightlifting, portrait painting, good times. Yep, community college in California was free. It was. Not basically free, it was free. And Matt says debt is such an unnecessary parasitic drag on the economy. Banksters are doing nothing productive in our economy. They're just landlords and gamblers. It is such a farce. Avril says, like James Brown profoundly sang during the days of true revolution, quote, reality is the thing for me, unquote. Yo, bring those sounds back. They're needed more than ever. Sandy says, I went to vocational school for free as well. The year after BI left, they started charging tuition. Kay says people who smoke and drink mostly have little to nothing to live for anymore in this county anyway. If it kills me, I'll at least be in peace for the first time in way too many years. Warren says, I wish Stephanie Kelton was running for president. Biden should choose her for VP. Well, he should, but okay, I'm afraid that Biden has pretty much committed to a black female at this point. So I think we'll probably all say that maybe Nina Turner. I think in ancient Rome they had jubilations. When an emperor died, all debts were forgiven. A brand new start. We should try it. For part of ancient Rome, I think they had that, but they had that, okay, in Babylon, I think every 7 years. I think that's where debt jubilees actually started. They were a regular part of the political system. Avril says President Kelton would be a shortcut to prosperity and the pursuit of happiness, paradise. Indeed. Lawrence says maybe the most radical and revolutionary thing so many Americans could do is to get to an AA meeting and sober up. Steve Wolfbrand said it would be interesting. Sandy says the water in North Jersey is horrible. You can't drink it. Warren Chamberlain, best reply of the night. Thank you. Kay says, I only have a few beers to put me to sleep at night. Okay. Avril Manna says, imagine the money you could save if you just bought some melatonin gummies instead. Well, I take a melatonin pill every night. That helps me out. Kay says, people are so judgmental these days. Avril, don't judge me. He's not judging you, Kay. You should try CBD oil, Kay. Avril says, I know your money is tight. I thought you might want to save some. Kay says, you guys should butt out. When I can grow my own, I will go back to poor. Avril says, that's expensive too, isn't it? Lauren asks, is it really a difficult thing to do to face the world stone cold sober? I think I face the world stone cold sober every day. I do have 3 ounces of wine for dinner and 1 ounce of wine during my live stream. Sandy says, depends. The one I buy is not. Steve says, both CBD and melatonin increase sleep quality. That may be. I know that melatonin has increased my sleep quality, which is very good these days. Kay says, I like beer, thank you. Avril says, how much and what brand, please? Been looking for recommendations. Sandy says, helps with back pain. Pain I have in my back and knees. Steve says, a few beers isn't going to hurt you. Russ says, I need to turn in, see you all again soon. Kay says, no, it isn't, Steve. Warren says, take a little NyQuil. Avril says, I had Baker's cysts behind the knees. Vitamin C helped and rats, but those fuckers hurt like hell. When I started getting some cramps behind the knees, actually my calves, I found that potassium citrate completely eliminated the problem. Kay says, I don't do chemicals. Laugh out loud. NyQuil is awful for you. Sandy says, mix RX 1,000 milligrams. I bought it on Amazon. 2 bottles for $27. What is Mix RX? Is that NyQuil? I think. $27, I think. I also get the peanut butter one for my dog. Sandy says, Kay, you do it makes you happy. Albert says, does it say they're tested for high arsenic levels? I found out that it's a huge issue among CBD oils. Lana says, I use Charlotte's Web CBD. It's pricey but reliable and safe. Sandy says, not sure they have a website. It's probably called Charlotte's Web, right? Steve Gonzo says, according to the DNC, the convention will be held in Milwaukee, but delegates told to stay home. They don't get to choose POTUS. Any notion progressives will have influence on Biden is out the window. Well, Biden still needs to get our votes. Kay says, I don't do anything through Amazon. That MFer has way too much money already. Avril says, Africa sending us a sandstorm. I wish whoever is playing the Jumanji 2020 Apocalypse Edition would put that game away. Sandy says, my dog and I are still alive, so I guess it's okay. Steve says, it's probably the best brand of CBD. Steve says, me neither. Evelina says, about to arrive in the Caribbean nations are prepping. Avril says, I saw that today. Steve says, you give the dog CBD? Kay says, coming all the way up here to Northeast Ohio, SFH. Steve Gonzo says, Tommy Chong has developed a pure CBD acetate that is rapidly absorbed, avoiding the liver. Oh, God. What has Cheech done lately? Sandy says, that story about the storm has been on the internet for a few days already. Today was the first day it was mentioned on the TV news. Avril says, wow, they're asleep. Steve says, I'm hoping the aliens show up to help us. Sandy says, yes, they also make one for dogs and she loves it. Kay says, news isn't really news anymore. Avril says, ditto. Steve says, it's more like entertainment than news. I go to indie media for news. Daniel Hopkins says, the progressives need to do it the old-fashioned way. We keep winning House races and we win local school board elections and other such positions to gain influence, experience, and recognition to get higher offices. What the John Birch, the city did, and their descendants run the Republican Party. It's very important to get all those down ballot races, and if we can't get anything else, we should certainly get them. But on the other hand, it's important also to win a Senate seat if we can, and if we can possibly get somebody into the presidency who's ours, that's also very, very important too. And Kay says, I love this info from Kelton. Big wake-up call. Thank you, Joe, for covering it. I'm not just covering it. I find I'm reading it. It's like reading one of my books, but better. I think getting progressives into the Congress and Senate is more important. Congress holds the purse. If something is going to get done, we need them both progressives. We certainly do. Bonnie says, hi, everyone. And Sandy says, hi, Bonnie. Kay says, hi, Bonnie. Lauren says, gives the USA Today story about the dust storm coming to the Gulf Coast in Texas from Africa. Revenge. Sandy says, it's good to get involved in the local government. You have a say in what happens. Matt says, another good show tonight. Thank you, Matt. It was good last night, too. Lauren says, I just completed my third 5-year term on my town's planning board. Got to meet a lot. I got to meet a lot of other elected and appointed public servants. Sandy says, I shared Joe's stream last night with Lawrence Ham. He gave it a thumbs up. Steve Wolfbrand said, hi, Bonnie. And Evelina says, Warren Chamberlain. And Avril says, I know homeless begging to go to jail just to get off the streets. Sandy says, my husband is also on our town's planning board, been on for over 30 years. Wow. Warren says, I hope Joe wants us up soon. I need to get to bed. Stephanie Kelton really has it all together. I'll be covering the last chapter tomorrow, by the way. Avril Mantle says, artificial scarcity kills the public. And Steve says, I'm trying to hit the lottery. If I hit, I'd help a lot of you fuckers out. Sandy says, it's probably safer for homeless women to do that than be on the street. And Avril says, thorough through and through. She explored and connected all the ends. Kay said, jails are full of COVID. It's a death sentence. Yeah. They quarantine and temp check in this area, Avril Mantle says. Steve Wolfman said, wow, so much truth from this book. Yes, there is a tremendous amount of truth from the book. Doesn't matter. Once you're in there, you are stuck. Steve says, we are so fucked up. They quarantine and temperature check on a regular basis, and it has worked. Where has it worked, Carmen? Sandy says, now nursing homes are pushing out the Medicaid patients to take COVID patients because they can make more profit from their insurance companies. Wonderful. Avril says, neo-feudalism. Kay says, whatever, I don't choose jail. That's why I just got booted for Medicaid. I save money, so I don't have to do that, hopefully, anyway. Avril says, I can believe it. Evelina says, shouldn't COVID patients be in a hospital? They don't necessarily all have to be in a hospital, but if they're not in a hospital, they should be in quarantine. Kay says, nursing facilities should never be, excuse me, should never be corporate owned. SMH. I agree. I don't think any healthcare facilities should be corporate owned. I think we should prohibit corporate owned healthcare facilities. Sandy says nursing homes, not hospitals. Evelina Pont, when it becomes severe. Okay, everything is now corporate in this country, and that is the main problem, of course. Avril says, correct. Senor Joe, neoliberalism is the bottom line. And their think tanks are our oppressors. They are part of the oppressor class. Yes. But their decision makers are bigger oppressors. Sandy says, I guess if they're older patients, they put them in the nursing homes to finish their recovery and to kill the nursing home patients, right? Kay says they don't care about patients anymore. They went out in 1980. The hospitals here did have room. Sandy says didn't. Oh dear. Yes, New Jersey had a tremendous number of cases, still does. Sandy says they don't care, but they want the money. Sandy says it was bad in NJ. Yes, on a deaths per million basis, it was very bad in New Jersey. I think second only to New York State. Sandy says we're still trying to get slowly back to some kind of normal. And Alvaro says, great reading, Dr. Joe. Your fluidity keyed me in that you were in the zone. Yes. Sandy says, it's nice to be read too. Thank you. Occasionally I comment. And Kay says, I doubt we ever get to a reasonable normal again at this rate. Sandy says, primary, the Deadwood. Steve says, Doc, we'll never get through all these comments. Sandy says, we were very chatty tonight. This chapter really got us talking. Steve said it was the best chapter. I think the next one's going to be even better. Sandy says, Pelosi needs to be gone. And Steve said, hashtag PSA, they're still cheating. Sandy said, I'm not sure about him, Joe. Sandy said, mix RX CBD. Daniel Goheen said, all these governors with these awful orders such as must stay home, must wear a mask, can't go to beach, must be 6 feet away from anybody, not only was unconstitutional, it's treason against American people. It's an arrestable offense by the sheriff. Personally, I think the sheriff who arrests people for wearing masks himself needs to be arrested and sent away for a very, very long time. Avram Mano says, and the COVID recovery bills are nothing but said manipulation for their cronies. Sandy says, it's nice to be read to. Great reading, Dr. Joe. Your fluidity keyed me you were in the zone. Avril said it has worked in the jail. Sandy says, bless you, Joe. Avril says, your comments are always spot on. Thank you, everyone. It is now 11:41. Contrary to prediction, I have gotten through all the comments, at least up to this time. So I will say good night now, and I invite you back tomorrow for Chapter 8, the final chapter. Now, that's not going to be the final one in this series on Stephanie Kelton's books, on Stephanie Kelton's book. I'm sure, I'll have, at least another full session on that to put a capper, on everything after I finish Chapter 8. But after that, we'll have Pavlina Chernyeva's book to turn to on the job guarantee, which in a way is going to put the capper onto everything. But for now, good night all. And I will see you tomorrow when we talk about policy, because the last chapter is on policy, of course. Sandy says, good night, Joe and Bonnie and everyone. Thank you. Good night.